So we got a terrific lecture today on two new books from our friend Don Prothero, who's paleontologist and geologist here at Caltech and at Occidental College and elsewhere, and he leads our geo tours. We've got two terrific geo tours coming up in 2014 that he'll tell you about as a preface to his lectures, but let me just plug his books. Of course, there's the classic Evolution, which I think this is your bestseller. I mean, this is your classic book. We still have copies of that. But the two new ones, Reality Check, How Science Deniers Threaten Our Future, big problem, science denial. And the book he co-authored with Daniel Loxton, Abominable Science, you can see them there. So we have plenty of copies of those, and this one just came out. I haven't even seen this one, Bringing Fossils to Life, an Introduction to Paleontology. This is this gorgeous fossil here that explains how that gets preserved and how you can go out and fossil hunt and all that kind of good stuff, which in our geo tours we'll actually have a chance to do some fossil hunting, which is really cool too. So with that, help me welcome Dr. Donald Prothero.
All right, so what I'm doing this afternoon, I'm going to try to condense what used to be two one-hour book talks or two completely separate books into a single talk, which will take some twisting and bending, but I think it'll work as soon as my PowerPoint loads. Okay, here it comes. All right. And so I'll start with talking about my new book with Daniel Loxton, Abominable Science, which is the first comprehensive book ever written, basically, about cryptozoology, the study of these creatures like Yeti, Nessie, the Bigfoot, and so on that have been alleged to exist, and how do we deal with those. But before I get to that, I want to mention there's a couple other books of mine that just came out or have come out recently. The one on the right there is on the table as well. This is a book I wrote, came out in January, about these gigantic rhinoceroses that lived in Mongolia about 30 million years ago and were the size of about 4 times the size of a modern elephant. So it's a whole sort of spectrum of what kinds of things we can turn to figure out about those. And then the other book, it just came out last week at the professional meetings I was at, the one there on the left, which is my new paleontology book. And I had one more book that was supposed to appear this year, but didn't come out in time. It's still delayed. Lest you think that's remarkable, I started some of these in 2009. It's all about production delays. So everything looks like it came out all at once in a traffic jam, but in fact, some of them should have been out last year. All right, so let's first talk about the topic of cryptozoology and this idea of, are these strange monsters real? And when I do this, I did what we did in the book, which is the first thing you need to do before you even talk about these monsters, is set down some ground rules about what the nature of science is and how science works. Because one of the biggest problems we have with all the stuff that's in the paranormal, whether it's UFOs or Bigfoot or ghosts, is that there's a fundamental problem with misunderstanding what science is. This is a very big deal as far as our American culture goes. And especially thanks to the media, we all have a very wrong notion of what science is about. So we have all these amazing images of mad scientists, both male and female in this case. The usual stereotype of mad scientist, which sadly still continues. Even my kids watch those mad scientist DVDs endlessly, with all the bubbling beakers and the sparking Van de Graaff generators and so on. And so you get what my friend Sharon Hill calls sham science. All these people on shows like Ghost Hunters and Monster Quest with their fancy equipment, right? They got these special, light-sensitive cameras, and they've got these night traps to see what animals have been by, and they walk around with various types of sensors. And this is sort of the idea that if you have the equipment, you're a scientist, okay? Right? Walking around with fancy toys does not make you a scientist. I'll show you in a moment. It's how you use your equipment that counts, okay? And a good analogy for that, if you've never heard this story before, are the so-called cargo cults in Polynesia. Right during and after World War II, when the American war effort was focused in the islands of Polynesia, they put up big air bases almost overnight. And of course, locals inherited all this wonderful materiel that came from the war effort. And then when the war was over, of course, the Navy pulled out of most of these places. And these native Polynesians were not happy. No more planes were landing. So they built these famous cargo cults, where all the cargo left behind by the military became part of their almost mythology. They built wooden-looking replicas of airplanes and hangars and even wooden radio masts. And the idea is to bring the airplanes back, okay? And so this is the problem we have. These guys are confusing the trappings of a military base with the real thing. Okay? And you're a cryptozoologist, you're a ghost hunter, they confuse the toys with the science. Okay? So science is not about what equipment you wear, white lab coats. I don't wear a white lab coat ever. Okay? I'm not a chemist. Okay? That's not necessary. The bubbling glass or any piece of equipment. It's a method of understanding the world. Okay? And the central idea, virtually all scientists would agree to something like this, any explanation of the world, the natural world, must be testable, primarily on the idea that we try to prove it wrong. Now, there's some philosophers who'd have various ideas about this later, but the philosopher Karl Popper about 50 years ago argued that one of the things that's unique about science is that what we do is we try to prove each other wrong all the time, what he called falsification. We can make statements like all swans are white, which is what's called an inductive generalization for those who are philosophers, but no number of white swans ever proves that statement true, right? You can just keep adding up all the white swans you want. You don't prove it true. One black swan proves it false. Okay, and of course there are black swans in Australia. Okay? And that's an important point to recognize. Science is always tentative. It's always about testing hypotheses and shooting them down, not about proving them true. Okay? We are never going to prove anything true in science in the way that we use the word, although the public doesn't use it the same way. It's not about final truth. We always have to be tentative, provisional, subject to testing. Science is always just the best explanation we have now. If you want final truth, you're not in the right business, okay? We aren't there, okay? Where ideologies, of course, like to offer you what they claim is final truth. But then when you watch how they do it, of course, they cherry pick their facts. They ignore whatever they want to ignore in order to make the world fit a pre-existing notion. I won't name any obvious examples, but I'm sure you can think of some, all right? Scientists have to reject ideas no matter how appealing they are if they are data against it. Otherwise, they're not doing science. A man from here at Caltech, Richard Feynman, said it very nicely. It doesn't matter how beautiful your theory is. It doesn't matter how smart you are. If it doesn't agree with experiments, it's wrong. Okay? And then the biggest difference between science and almost any other aspect of human endeavor is that we have the system of peer review. You have to have a very thick skin in science because everything you do, if it's done right, is subjected to this incredible barrage of anybody who doesn't like you and hates you tearing you down. Okay? And you have to be able to stand up to that and argue your case and hopefully make the case that you, in fact, have a strong argument that can survive publication. We are very hard on each other. None of us want the garbage to slip through. And, of course, it doesn't always happen. Sometimes peer review just doesn't catch it, so someone else catches it. But down the line, 2-3 years down the line, if it's been really scrutinized and no scientist has been able to shoot it down, then we start to take it seriously, okay, which no other form of human endeavor is really about. And the reason that's important, of course, is that you are your worst reviewer, okay? As Feynman again says, the first principle is you must not be fooled by yourself because you're the easiest person to fool, right? We all love our pet ideas. It's what our colleagues think of our pet ideas that count. Well, I love this little thing I found on the internet here. Science, if you don't make mistakes, you're doing it wrong. If you don't correct the mistakes, you're doing it really wrong. If you can't accept that you're mistaken, you're not doing it at all. Okay, so now let's start to apply this to cryptozoology, which is trying to sound and trying to act like science, but they don't get it. They don't realize you have to actually do it like a scientist, not just look like one. Okay? And this is one of the biggest problems they have, what Daniel sniffed out endlessly in our book, just a giant pile of bad data. Every time stuff is debunked, they don't throw it out. Right? They just keep adding more and more of this stuff. If you look at the majority of these accounts of any of these beasts that are supposed to exist, they're either too vague, or they're really, really old, in which case you can't trust the source pretty much, or they don't basically match each other, and yet they're all attributed to the same creature, okay? They give discrepant versions of this animal as if it's all the same thing. Many of these are actual admitted hoaxes by the hoaxer himself. Okay, so far no female hoaxers I know of in this field, okay? And yet they don't take it out. They just keep using it and piling it on as if it'll impress somebody who doesn't know any better. And so it needs a giant gardener to weed it. It's so full of garbage, and yet they never weed their own gardens. Okay? So as scientists, what we look for them to do, if they really want to be taken seriously, as other scientists would be, first of all, the business of objectivity. Subjective personal experience does not mean very much. Scientists try to be objective. Okay? Must be observable by anyone else, not just your personal observation. Scientists, although we don't do this always, we try, eliminate your bias. You don't set up your experiment to prove what you want to believe. You try to actually prove yourself wrong. Okay, they don't tend to do that very often. And if you find something that's odd, it's not supernatural or paranormal. It's just so far unexplained. Scientists live with the fact that things don't get explanations right away. Someday they probably will. Scientists are always trying, if they can, to set up controls to rule out the possibility of random background noise. This is especially a big problem with things like Bigfoot, where people who have no idea what wildlife is out there attribute every sound and everything they see to Bigfoot because they don't know what they're doing. Plausibility. How strong is your evidence in the face of all the facts against it? As the facts pile up, your case gets weaker and weaker, even if it's not definitive yet. And then again, as I mentioned a moment ago, the real cutting edge thing that makes it science and not science, could you put your stuff up for peer review and still stand up after it's over? That's what you need to be taken seriously. And especially in the case of cryptozoology and the paranormal, as Carl Sagan and many others have said, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, right? You don't need much evidence to establish a new species of insect, or even a new species of, say, raccoon, like was just published in the news about 2 months ago. A new species of a primate bigger than us requires more evidence than normal zoologists get, okay? So the burden of proof is on them, and you cannot resort to what is common in the case in pseudoscience of special pleading or ad hoc hypotheses, right? If you say, well, we don't have any bones of Bigfoot, well, Bigfoot's an alien. He leaves no bones. You know, you stop doing science right there, okay? So in this quote of Huxley's mine, I use it almost everywhere. I love it. The great tragedy of science, the slaying of a beautiful hypothesis by an ugly fact, okay? Now, one classic thing you see among pseudoscience of every kind was called credential mongering. Now, putting the word PhD on your cover next to your name is almost always a red flag to me. You don't need to waive your credentials, especially if your credentials aren't relevant to what you're writing or saying, okay? This is the classic case when you look at the history of cryptozoology. They've had one or two in their entire history actual people with doctorates, okay, which they, of course, make big fuss about. This is one of them, still alive, born in 1925, a guy named Roy Mackal. He was a conventionally trained fruit fly geneticist at the University of Chicago. Got tenure after doing lots of nice experiments on fruit flies. Then went to Loch Ness in 1965 and somehow had a conversion experience. Who knows what he saw or didn't see. But then he stopped working on what he was trained to do, spent the rest of his life thrashing around the jungles of Africa or back at Loch Ness, wrote books about both Nessie and Mokele Mbembe. He had no formal training in field ecology, right? It's not the same thing as having a PhD in fruit flies, okay? You actually have to have a PhD in field ecology to be qualified to do this. But you'll see cryptozoologists saying, Roy Mackal, PhD, like his PhD magically makes him expert at every field. No more than it makes him an expert in fixing a car or writing a symphony. Only the time I take someone's PhD seriously is if they're actually in the field they're talking about. Now, the biggest issue in this whole discussion of cryptozoology is quality of evidence. And the kind of evidence are we going to take as scientists to accept what they claim? Ideally, what we really like, if they could ever come up with it, which hasn't happened yet, is something physical, right? An actual bone, a carcass, a live animal would be great if I could get that. Even teeth, even real hair, okay? Any of that would be acceptable, okay? So far, nothing that has ever survived scrutiny, okay? What they like especially is this, what I call so-so evidence. Photos, videos, recordings of sounds. Well, lots of ways those are faked, as I'll show you in a moment here. It's very, very hard to make much out of that, okay? And you'll see this on the internet every few weeks, another Bigfoot video, and then you play it, and it's a little blur that you can't tell much of anything about, okay? What I count as almost not evidence at all, crummy evidence, footprints, scratch marks. Well, lots of things have footprints and scratch marks, and the most of footprints, by the way, are easily hoaxed, and they, in fact, have a long history of it. What I do not count as evidence in any way is eyewitness testimony, which is 95% of their evidence right there. Not just kind of I'm biasing my case against them. That's because there's reasons we don't trust eyewitness testimony anymore. You think, oh, well, eyewitness is the best possible thing. A person saw it, therefore it must be true. What's happened now, if you look at the last 30 years of psychological research, okay, a number of psychologists have shown this. Humans are terrible DVRs, okay? Terrible tape recorders for an earlier generation, okay? We do not record with fidelity. We do not remember well. We often color or modify what we thought we saw the first time, or we see it poorly and then fill in the details. Courts of law now are going far against eyewitness testimony because they're a wide open gate for the defense to get your client off. Okay, because basically eyewitnesses are terrible. The point being, that's what's called selective attention disorder. You focus on one thing, you are not a reliable witness on anything else that's going on. If you catch Bigfoot out of the corner of your eye while you're driving, the question is, are you really driving correctly or are you actually watching Bigfoot, okay? All right, so this is a big problem. We are terrible recorders of evidence. We're easily convinced by what's called anecdotal evidence. Somebody tells us they said something or saw something, we take it seriously, right? We get our advice about our medicine from our back fence neighbor, not a scientific way of doing things. And Frank Sulloway said this nicely. Anecdotes don't make science. 10 anecdotes are not better than 1, and 100 anecdotes are no better than 10. I'll give you some examples of this if you haven't already heard of a lot of examples. This is a famous one in the news a few years ago in 2004. A hunter was out hunting hogs, and he heard someone holler the word hog. He swung over, he saw something moving, blasted away at it. It was his own son wearing a toboggan cap. Not even a hog costume, a toboggan cap. Okay? Michael here has talked about his capture by aliens on one of his cross-country races across America, where he was in, about 78 hours of continual deprivation from riding your bicycle, and he thought his support vehicle was an alien ship that was trying to capture him.
No, that actually happened. That was real.
Oh, okay. All right, well, I stand corrected then. Some of you remember the famous 2002 DC sniper panic, okay? They were all over the news for weeks because the guys were running around with a sniper car, basically. They didn't catch them because they had the wrong search image. They were told to look for a white box van with white drivers. And as you remember the story, they caught Lee Mohammed and Lee Malvo, two black men, as the policeman says, two black men in a blue car, and they were looking for white cars and white men. Okay, and these guys actually went through the police checkpoints multiple times, but they had the wrong description. Okay? What about memories? Lots of people use that kind of stuff. We have many evidence, I'm sure you've found evidence in your own history where you remember something as being such and such a way, and then you go back and find out it's not the case. We know this from UFO abductions. We know things like stress and sleep loss will give people what they think are UFO abductions. Something else to remember, whenever you're dealing with a non-Western culture, particularly a culture which is very different from ours, like the Congo Pygmies or whatever, what they consider reality may be different from what you and I consider reality, right? Their mythology may be just as real to them as what you and I would say is a myth, right? Nobody around here is looking for the Thunderbirds that the Native Americans used to take seriously, but that's just as credible as some of the myths that a lot of these other people are looking for, okay? And the worst thing you can do when you're dealing, especially with a non-Western culture, show them a picture of a brontosaur in the middle of the Congo, okay? That's called leading the witness. It's not allowed in a court of law, right? You can ask them to draw it, but if you show them a picture, you're planting what you want them to see in the process, okay? And it turns out in our research, we found this is true, especially of Yeti, that many cultures consider impolite to not tell you what you want to hear, right? They're trying to please you, okay? Doesn't make them necessarily telling you the truth. So what you'll find in cryptozoology, a lot of this, yeah, I like that gorilla. It's particularly appropriate. A lot of this business say, oh, well, they didn't find the mountain gorilla or the copy till 1901. That's well over 100 years ago, folks, okay? We know a lot more about the Congo jungle than we did 100 years ago, okay? And the rest of these discoveries, well, the Komodo dragon would be sort of a cryptid-like thing, but it's 100 years since we found that. The more recent ones, like the Kukri and the Chaco and peccary, they're very similar to modern species, as all these newer discoveries are. There's only a zoologist could have told the difference. So there's really no really startling or surprising animals found in more than a century, at least on land. Of course, in the ocean's a different deal. The deep ocean has things we always discover are quite remarkable. We get more really strange species of squid from deep water all the time. They always point at the coelacanth and say, oh, well, we can always find a strange anomaly like the coelacanth. No, we can't. It's a rare type of situation to see something like that. And even then, it proves nothing about life on land. It's just that these things live in extremely deep water and never been collected before until they were accidentally found in 1937 out of South Africa. Then they found a population of them off the Comoros, which is north of Madagascar. Then recently now we have populations in Indonesia and again in South Africa. So they're not as rare as we once thought, okay? And if you see people say, oh, they've been extinct for 50 million years according to paleontologists, no, they got it off by an order of magnitude. It's 5 million years of the youngest coelacanth fossil. Okay, so this proves nothing. Now, what Daniel and I tried to do, and especially in my background, because I have a background in field ecology and a background in paleontology, is to try to apply what field ecologists and paleontologists now have really worked out over the last 50 years of research, namely that there are lots of things we know about organisms that allow us to constrain what is possible and what is not. None of this has ever entered in the crypto literature as far as I can find, okay? And the most obvious thing is it's a law of diminishing returns, right? You just keep on looking and looking, and if you find less and less, that's not a good sign for your cryptid, okay? In fact, the more people are looking now, the less we're finding. There was lots of sightings when there was nobody looking. Now everyone's looking and nothing is being found, okay? So the chances of finding a cryptid are getting worse with time. In zoology, it's well understood. In the early phases, discovering animals, like this is discovering all the various types of seals, sea lions, and walruses. Lots of discoveries are made every few decades or so. And then for the last century, 1 or 2 species is all that's been found. A large animal like that is hard to miss. It's not likely we're going to find many, many more species of seals, sea lions, and walruses. The biggest problem with cryptids, as Daniel established, especially in the chapters he focused on, was that there's a tendency to take cultural symbols and become biological entities. Okay? We have a strong tendency, if you look at the history of this, for any kind of media influence. In the old days, it was newspapers and newsreels, and now it's TV specials and the internet. But it's always the media of some kind. A big sighting, a big splashy sighting comes up, and all of a sudden there's 1,000 copycats and 1,000 more sightings. Everyone else sees it all of a sudden. And then about 5 years down the line, it's forgotten again, and there are no more sightings. Okay? That's not a biological pattern. That's a cultural pattern. Okay? This does not support the idea this thing was alive before then and then suddenly was spotted and then somehow stopped showing up after 5 years. It shows that there's just media fatigue after 5 years. Okay? Daniel showed this very nicely, although others had pointed out before. The iconical image of the Loch Ness monsters, a plesiosaur with a long neck and all the rest, was not anywhere recorded until the year after King Kong, the original 1933 version, was aired in Britain. And the guy who first described it as plesiosaur, Spicer, had actually seen the movie. And then, lo and behold, all subsequent versions of Loch Ness Monster follow the version from King Kong. Right? Literally, the movie made the monster in this case. Or even more recently, in the 1980s and 1990s, there was no report of a chupacabra anywhere in the world. It did not exist as a creature until a Puerto Rican woman, Madeline Tolentino, saw the movie Species with Natasha Henstridge, an old horror sci-fi flick some of you may remember. And the beautiful Natasha Henstridge turns into this horrible monster Syl. It's partially filmed in Puerto Rico at the Arecibo Space Telescope. And she apparently doesn't realize Hollywood actually doesn't tell the truth sometimes. Because she did not realize the movie was fiction, even though it was filmed partially in Puerto Rico. She assumed they actually had a monster like Syl in their laboratories by the Space Telescope. So in a few days after she saw the movie, she saw the monster outside her house. And then reported to tabloids, and lo and behold, guess what happens? Everyone in Puerto Rico suddenly sees Chupacabra. Okay? Then gets on the Christina show. She's the Oprah, or was the Oprah of Latin America. So every Latin American country that spoke Spanish, at least, all of a sudden they all had chupacabras coming out of the woodwork. Okay? None had ever been reported, and suddenly, as soon as it's on national television, everyone sees it. Here's another constraint. We have this sort of romanticized image of the Pacific Northwest as the old growth forest with lots of spotted owls and not a logger in sight, right? Well, if you've ever been into Oregon or Washington coastal forests, this is what they look like today. They're clear-cut in a grotesquely extreme fashion. In fact, Daniel spent his early life as a shepherd working in these clear-cuts while they were still replanting them and moving his sheep around through them before they got planted. That's where he spent a lot of time in woods where Bigfoot should have existed. There's not many places to hide a Bigfoot. Right? The only place you can hide them is in the screen of trees right at the highway where they try to keep the tourists from seeing what they do behind the screen of trees. Think about our planet now. 7 billion people. There's hardly a place on this planet that we don't have people all the time. Except Antarctica, which doesn't count here. All right? So clear cutting. Tropical rainforests are not the pristine, inaccessible places you probably romanticize them to be. Even more obvious, you can go back to your laptop right now, or maybe even this room if the Wi-Fi's good, and watch it from space. Get your Google Earth up, start zooming in, look for Kelly Mbembe for me. Happy to let you take the time. I'm not going to spend any more time myself, okay? Your satellite image is so good, it depends on what your browser can do, but you can see amazing stuff from Google Earth, okay? Anything the size of a dinosaur in the Congo, we would have dozens of people spotting from space by now. This is images of elephants from Google Earth. I can resolve their tail hairs and their tusks. And more important than this, expert observers, real wildlife biologists who know what animal's which, when they walk through these forests, and this is true with the Bigfoot sightings and McKinley Mbembe, these places are not virgin territory. Real biologists are there all the time. They are never reporting cryptids. They report lots of animals that are real. They never see cryptids. Only clumsy amateurs do. Okay? And this, I think, is sort of the death knell in the entire topic. I found this on the internet as well, but this is a beautiful illustration of it. Those that haven't read it ahead of me already. Percentage of the population carrying cameras everywhere they go, every moment of awake, like this. You and I probably all have it in our pockets right now, hopefully turned off. In the last few years, with very little fanfare, we conclusively settled the question of flying saucers, lake monsters, ghosts, and Bigfoot. And the buzz I heard at 10 this summer is that Spielberg himself apparently has thought about this and decided UFOs are not real. The one guy who made UFOs more real than anyone on the planet, and he doesn't believe in them himself anymore. Now, as a biologist, I was trained in biology as well as in geology, becoming a paleontologist. There's some other things they tend to neglect. They don't think like biologists, so they forget that these things are important. You can't have a Bigfoot or a Loch Ness monster, especially not over centuries. There's got to be a population, right? It doesn't live forever. It's got to have a population. So the larger the breeding population, the less likely, if we haven't seen anything reliable in a long time, that there's anything there at all. Okay? And we know this from biology. The home range of an animal is very tightly correlated to its body size. An animal like a gorilla, which is actually smaller than Bigfoot is supposed to be, has a gigantic home range, as big as some states. All right? Yet we can't seem to get a reliable reporting or anything of these things. Okay? They should be so widespread and so many of them that we'd be tripping on them everywhere we go. And yet that's not what we're getting. Now, when it comes to things like the lake monsters, Loch Ness in Scotland, for example, the lake monsters in Lake George and Okanagan and Mount Magog and all the rest, they all have their supposed lake monster, which is great boon for the tourists every summer. That's what they sell there, is views of the lake monster. They can forget an inconvenient truth from geology. All those lakes were under glacial ice caps only 10,000 to 20,000 years ago. A mile or more of ice. Where do you put your lake monster while it's waiting for the lake to thaw? Okay? And if they're a sea monster, why are they in the lakes and not in the ocean? And by the way, all these lakes are landlocked, so it's a little hard to get a marine animal in them in the first place. Now, as a paleontologist, this is something I thought was really neglected in the arguments that need to be made here. Paleontologists are fully aware of what's good and what's not so good about the fossil record. We know it's not perfect. But one of the things about the last 20 years of research on how fossilization occurs has shown us is that animals with large bones, like rhinos and elephants and presumably Bigfoot and Mokele Mbembe, should preserve pretty well, because the fossils of those things do. The bigger the bone, the harder it is to break and lose it. Okay? And I was working on Ice Age mammals for years now, especially over at Liberia Tarbert, so we have 3 million Ice Age mammal bones. Okay? And most of the Ice Age localities around North America have tens of thousands of specimens in their collections. Gigantic sample, even of the rarest animals in North America for the last 2 million years. Not a single primate, let alone anything possibly related to Bigfoot. It's not like we've been hiding anything here. There isn't anything here. Okay? The same goes for places like the rest of the world. There are no fossil dinosaurs or plesiosaurs in any part of the fossil record after they died out at the end of the Mesozoic, 65 million years ago. And we have beds like Sharktooth Hill up there in Bakersfield, where you can see marine mammals and other things that live in the ocean after the plesiosaurs vanished. So we're not missing things just because we don't have the preservation. We just don't have them because they didn't exist. Especially Africa. It turns out Africa has an excellent fossil record of dinosaurs. And after 65 million, lots of large mammals, no dinosaurs. So it's not an absence of evidence. There's evidence of what lived in these places. It's just not these animals that we're talking about. Now, I don't have time to give you all the different stories of all of them. I'll just select a couple of them here. That's Daniel's original of Bigfoot there, by the way. I'll make it quick and short for Bigfoot. Nada. Thumbs down, okay? No physical evidence whatsoever. Not a bone, not anything, not even a tuft of hair. If you've been following the ridiculous story from Melba Ketchum and the Bigfoot DNA thing, I have 2 blog posts up on skepticblog.org if you want to read them. Every bit of it shows that she does not know what she's doing in genetics. Because when the independent scientists looked at her research, it was garbage. It was human DNA and a bunch of other wild animals, and one she forgot to sample, which turned out to be important, a possum. If you guys know how opossums are everywhere in our part of the world, okay? And the bigger question, even if she got an unknown DNA, does that establish a Bigfoot exists? No. It established something we don't know exists. It doesn't make it Bigfoot, right? You have to actually have Bigfoot to know what Bigfoot DNA looks like, okay? And they say, oh, well, their bones mysteriously disappear faster than the others. And that's why we never find them. We never find bare bones. They say, oh, sorry, I found bare bones. Daniel found bare bones. Actually, some of the people in cryptozoology report finding bare bones. Bears are not rare or common animals, but they do leave bones behind. Bigfoot never leaves a bone. Of course, it's rife with famous hoaxes. This was one you might remember from 2008, the Georgia Bigfoot hoax. Got on all the media, right? Because the media now is a 24-hour monster that has to be fed with stories, even if they're garbage, right? They have no control anymore, no review, no fact checkers in the old-fashioned way of journalism. That's gone. Facts are not relevant anymore. Okay, and so this got on the media for 2 whole weeks before it was finally cracked and debunked. It's a Bigfoot suit in a freezer is what it is. Okay? The Bigfooters, this is their favorite case, the famous Patterson-Gimlin film. They see it and they see something that isn't human. Most outside observers say, that's a guy in a suit. Okay? They say, oh, it has a walk that no human can make. Believe me, watch actors, they can walk any way you ask them to. Okay? The gait is clearly not of an ape of any kind. If you've ever watched a gorilla walk or an orangutan walk, you know they don't walk anything like the so-called Patterson-Gimlin film Bigfoot does. But even if you say, okay, it's inconclusive, where we don't know for sure what this footage shows, let's look at its source. Patterson was a legendary prankster and a hoaxer and a con man. He had debts to everybody he knew he never paid back. He never worked an honest day in his life. He knew he was dying of cancer when this thing happened in 1967, and he needed something to pay his family lifetime time, okay? Gimlin was also a well-known prankster, okay? Conveniently, they got perfect footage the first day they went out in 1967. It's never been done by anyone else, even days and days in the field. Now, what's even more damning, as Daniel pointed out, the first report of Bigfoot in the form we now associate with it was done about 12 years earlier by a Canadian by the name of William Rowe, published in a newspaper and then forgotten. No one ever interviewed Rowe later. He died before they could. And if you read this 12-year-old account, and the Bigfooters knew this account, it's as if it's a script for the character in the movie. Okay? It tells him exactly how many paces to take, when to turn over his right shoulder. It's got the description of the body that matches the suit. This was not widely known except in Bigfoot circles. And lo and behold, it manages to follow that script perfectly, which is a rather interesting coincidence. And then, by the way, the man in the costume, Bob Aranimus, has confessed. So has the woman who tailored the costume to make the arms longer. It's all, of course, discounted by the Bigfooters, but that's there. And any other film or video you show me, same problem. Okay? What about trackways? The first trackways, made by a guy named Ray Wallace back in the 30s and 40s, were all over the construction sites up by Bluff Creek up in the Klamath. His descendants have found his track-making Bigfoot shoes. He was a prankster. We all knew that long ago. Every other trackway then just turned out to be a hoax. You follow the internet now and just type in Bigfoot. What do you get? You get this. Blobs in the dark, right? Well, that may be a baby bear if a mama bear is right there. Who knows what the heck that is? And that could be just as easily a person. We all call those blob squatches, right? There's the scale of blob squatchery up there, from real well-resolved to Patterson-Gimlin. The blob squatch can be any shape. You have to have a bump to just the head. If it looks like the Patterson-Gimlin film, it's like the walk sign for the people. You either put it behind a tree to make them fill in the blanks. If all else fails, use a red circle. So the big problem is Bigfoot's blurry. And here he is searching for a page for his Facebook profile. Every one of my pictures is so freaking blurry. So I would say the answer is pretty clear, despite your friend's loyal devotion to Bigfoot. All this evidence, this forest vanishing, not enough sustained a population, every bit of observational evidence is garbage or worse. The more we look, the fewer good reports there are, which is not a good sign. Okay? It's been about 80 years now since Bigfoot emerged on the landscape. So here, some of you might remember the old comic strip Wizard of Id. Report from the Bigfoot research team. Hi, we totally found him and stuff, but like all our cameras stopped working at the same time, dude. Weird, huh? So we're going to need a bunch more funding. And the king asks, aren't you the same folks as the UFO research team? Okay, one more cryptid quickly here, and then I'll get on. This is one that I wrote the chapter about because as a paleontologist, I felt I could do a little bit more to this. Is there supposedly a dinosaur living in the Congo? Hollywood, of course, likes you to believe that. When you actually go carefully through all the descriptions and all the literature, there's nothing in common with any of the accounts, okay? Some look like a dinosaur sauropod, some look like a stegosaur, some like a triceratops. Many of them appear to be rhinos. You say, well, how would they not know a rhino? These are jungle people. Rhinos don't live in the jungle. The rhinos is an alien to them as a UFO is, okay? They don't see them. The creature supposedly submerges indefinitely. It turns out that's not possible for any animal to do, and those rivers aren't that deep to begin with. Most accounts, if you look at the shows on things like Monster Quest, which I was on this episode of Monster Quest, by the way, the people they're interviewing, first of all, they're leading the witness with pictures of what they want them to say yes to, and secondly, it's clear that these guys are just saying, yeah. They're agreeing with everything they're told to agree with, okay? And of course, just like Bigfoot, everything that's ever been photographed or otherwise recorded is useless or worse. Most times it's hippos, two guys in a canoe. You can't tell what it is most of the time, actually, okay? Now, what's even more damning about Mokele-Mbembe is the strong pile of negative evidence, okay? We have an excellent fossil record from Africa, especially large-bodied animals like the mammals we have since the age of dinosaurs. Not a dinosaur bone to be found. And again, an animal this body size, a huge range. There would be thousands of them wandering around the Congo if there really were a population. And sure enough, somebody would find that, at least from Google Earth. But the really interesting, sort of revealing thing, which Daniel and I both pointed out in the book, is that the version of Mokele-Mbembe doesn't actually match anything that ever lived in the past, let alone lives now. Because what they are trying to match is the way people thought about dinosaurs a century ago when they thought they were big, sluggish, slow-moving lizards in swamps that were half in the water all the time, with their tails dragging behind them like a lizard. All the recent data that we see about trackways from dinosaurs and all sorts of stuff shows they held their tails out straight. They never dragged them. They didn't live in the water at all. In fact, they mostly live in dry savannas and only rarely went to the water. So what they were trying to match was a mistake made a century ago. And by the people who were the first to supposedly observe this, which were, by the way, missionaries, not scientists. Okay, so why do they believe this? I borrowed Michael's title here. Why do people believe these weird things, okay? You think about it. We're the first culture probably ever in human existence that doesn't believe in monsters as an acceptable way of looking at things, right? Even a couple of generations ago, there were still monsters in everyone's vocabulary, okay? It's rather hard for us to actually live this way, right? We aren't accustomed to living without our monsters, okay? Almost all cultures through all times have had their share of monster stories and big legends. And it's very hard to erase that kind of deep psychological imprint with only the last 50 years of scientific thinking. That's probably the single best answer I can give you. And I wrote a whole chapter on it. There's a lot of other answers, but this is the main one. Believe it or not, more than 20, 30%, maybe more of Americans believe Bigfoot's real. And actually about the same percentage believe UFOs are real and ghosts are real, by the way. It works out the same way. So people really do want to believe, right? The X-Files knew exactly what it was doing. They tapped into that vein of giving people the mysterious. And you'll get these cryptozoologists say, well, Bigfoot's real. It's a biological entity. But no, UFOs aren't. That's silly stuff, okay? They want to be taken seriously as scientists, quote unquote. But if you look closely at it, the surveys that have been done, turns out most people believe in Bigfoot also believe in UFOs, and some actually mix the two stories, okay? And you ask a Bigfooter, okay, you accept Bigfoot on this evidence, which is mostly circumstantial evidence and eyewitness evidence of dubitable quality, but that's the same evidence that supports UFOs. The same evidence supports ghosts, fairies, right? More people believe in ghosts than in Bigfoot. So who's wrong? Something wrong there. There's a disconnect, okay? This is a big problem. You can't get them to face it, but it is. So could they be scientific? Okay. As you saw me just point out, they don't match the criteria of science I described at the beginning right now. They don't have testable rejected ideas that they don't throw out every once because they should be throwing them out. This is what they would have to do, which don't hold your breath expecting them to do this. Don't assume that if it's not yet explained, it's unexplainable and paranormal. That's the first problem. Unexplained does not equal unexplainable. Just means we haven't gotten around to explaining it yet, or may not be conclusive enough to anybody explain it. You must have high quality data. No more eyewitnesses, thank you. I don't need them. They're no good than they were the first time. Don't waste our time unless you have physical remains, except nothing less than a bone or a skeleton. Hair now is quality is not much use. Don't repeat the old debunked stories without weeding them out, as I said at the beginning. Publish in real journals. Subject your stuff to peer review. And most of all, they should, I like them to, I don't expect this to happen, be open to criticism and be skeptical. We found out what happens when that happens. Our Amazon.com reviews for the book, like 33 5-star reviews and 4 1-star reviews from people who admit they only read part of one chapter because they didn't want to hear the news. Now you say, oh, it's harmless, and Daniel actually believes this doesn't really hurt anybody. I'm a little more skeptical of that. I think cryptozoology is a gateway drug to bad thinking. Okay? It promotes sloppy, anti-scientific, non-rational, illogical thinking, and these people often are victims of more than one kind of pseudoscience. And here's a really big thing I think is a serious issue. These are the Bigfoot hunters that were on that episode of Monster Quest that I was on. Well, I didn't meet them, thankfully. They showed me when I watched them on TV that all they were was amateurs who didn't know what rights had of any piece of equipment they were playing with, and certainly didn't know much about African jungles. Okay? They're all creationist ministers. Not one of them has ever taken a biology course, let alone become trained in the field of ecology. And this is why they're out there. They believe if they discover Mokele Mbembe, or they discover a Loch Ness Monster, it will disprove all of evolution. Like one isolated specimen that's happened to stick around through longer than it's supposed to suddenly overwhelms thousands and thousands of pieces of data and experiments. Again, that shows you how little they know about evolution. And right now in Louisiana schools, they are teaching that Loch Ness Monster is real in an effort to undermine evolution. They were going to throw that away, and then they just reinstated it. So, as I say, let the buyer beware. Caveat emptor. If it seems too good to be true, it probably ain't. Okay, that's the quick and dirty version of my first book talk. Let me quickly now segue into the other one so we can talk about either one if you like to. I'll start out with a quiz here. Everybody think about this list as I go through it here. See who you think I'm describing. Scientific consensus about this particular idea accepted by 99% of all the scientists who work in the relevant fields. Okay, number 2, this scientific topic threatens the viewpoints of certain groups in the U.S., so it's strongly opposed by them and the people they influence. Their anti-scientific viewpoint is extensively promoted by websites and publications of right-wing fundamentalist institutes, Discovery Institute in Seattle, Fox News. The opponents of consensus cannot find many legitimate scientists with expertise in their field to oppose a consensus of qualified scientists, so they beat the bushes for any scientists, usually who don't have relevant credentials, to compose a phony list of scientists who disagree with topic X. Okay, continue this list here. Deniers of the scientific consensus resort to taking quotes out of context. Now, you think you know what I'm going to get to, but I haven't told you yet. To make legitimate scientists sound like they question the consensus. These people often look for small disagreements among the scientists and scholars in the field to argue the entire field does not support their assertions. Okay? The deniers often pick on small errors by individuals. And one guy makes a mistake, therefore a whole field is false. This is their black and white way of looking at the world. They often take small examples of side issues. They miss the forest for the trees. They get you all diverted on something really minor, and they completely ignore the giant consensus sitting in the middle of the room. All right? They spend most of their energy disputing what scientists have done. They don't do science themselves. Right? This is all about PR, not about science. Now, you think what I'm going to get at? Let me give you a couple more descriptors here. They cherry pick scientific data they didn't produce and don't understand to show the opposite of what's actually in the data if you do understand it. Okay? They loudly proclaim their alternate theories, and they get their paid hacks and their PR people to do all they can to confuse the public about the scientific consensus. So what 99% of scientists agree is true, about half of Americans think is true. It's all about PR. And you don't know what group I'm talking about yet, do you? And a big contrast. Most other westernized nations, developed nations, almost all of Europe, China, Japan, Singapore, and Canada, not that different from us, okay? No problems with the scientific consensus. There are no deniers that have any influence, at least not in politics. Okay, and so they're, again, mostly part of this right-wing Fox News bubble. The same lies get repeated over and over again. They never hear the counter-argument. So who do you think I'm describing? Both creationists and climate deniers. They play the exact same playbook. Okay, they actually overlap tremendously, as I'll show you. Okay, it's actually a strategy, as Michael pointed out in a couple earlier books, that came back from not just creationists, but the Holocaust deniers. I mean, there are people still alive today who survived the Holocaust, and the Nazis gleefully documented everything they did. Okay, and yet there are significant numbers of people who deny the Holocaust exists, or they'll say it wasn't as bad as we seem to say it is. We think that evidence seems uncontrovertible, and yet there are people who can make a case that they argue is not real. And what do? Same strategy now all these deniers use. Quote mining out of context, attack small details of the research, cherry pick data to support their ideas without seeing the bigger part of it, and they show a distortion of it. Making an honest scholarly debate within a field sound like we don't know what we're talking about. Scientists are always arguing. If we aren't, we're not doing science. Okay? And if we stop arguing, then you should be suspicious, okay? And they're focusing on what we don't know rather than the fact we have lots of evidence, okay? The other place you get this kind of strategy came out in the 1950s when a PR firm by the name of Knowlton and Hart made this famous document, which here's the famous quote from it: "Doubt is our product, since it's the best means of competing with the quote-unquote body of fact that exists in the minds of the general public. It's also the means of establishing controversy." So if you can't win by science, you do it by PR, okay? And this is what they told them to do back in the 1950s, and for 50 years, exactly what's happened. Only in the late part of the 90s did finally nail down the tobacco companies, get their executives on the floor of Congress. They had to use the RICO Act, what they used for mafia, to get on the floor of Congress and basically perjure themselves, denying all the stuff they had done, okay? Now, I'll show you, this applies to any kind of science denier. They all use some of these strategies, most of them use them all. The smokescreen strategy that the tobacco companies started with PR covering up the truth. Creationists are famous for being chameleons, right? Back in the 60s, they were just biblical creationists, and then they got struck down by a court ruling, so they became scientific creationists. What did they do? Took the name God out of the book. The rest is the same, okay? And then they were struck down by another Supreme Court ruling. So then all of a sudden they are intelligent design creationists. Then they were struck down in 2005 in the Dover case. Now what do? It's teach the controversy, right? It just gets slicker and slicker to overcome the legal system, nothing having to do with what they actually have done, okay? This is a famous quotation from Frank Luntz, the guy who will sell his soul to anybody, who at the time was working for the Bush administration, and then he shows up on Bill Maher now and then. It's really amazing. He wrote this: "The scientific debate is closing against us, but not yet closed. There is still a window of opportunity to challenge the science. Voters believe there is no consensus about global warming within the scientific community. Should the public come to believe that such issues are settled, their views about global warming will change accordingly. Therefore, you need to continue to make the lack of scientific certainty." Scientists are never certain. It's always a probability statement, right? If I say, you jump off that building, you're certain to die, I'm not doing it scientifically. I'll say your chances are 99% you'll die, right? That's a scientific way of doing it, okay? We don't have certainty in science. Remember, everything is testable and falsifiable. That's a word from the outside science. Certainty is a primary issue of debate and defer to scientists experts in the field, okay? It's all about PR, right? About creating a smokescreen, and it's a huge amount of money, which I'll show you in a moment where it comes from. This is something, a minute the scientist does this, you know, it's like getting a black mark, an F on your report card as far as other scientists are concerned. But this is a common strategy among anti-scientists. Cherry-picking data. Grab one thing out of context, use it to show what you want. Creationists will grab it, you know, some small anomaly in radiometric dating we don't completely understand. Say, oh, therefore all dating is unreliable, just because one little piece of it doesn't work too well, okay? Or they'll do ridiculous things like say, oh, well, the magnetic field is getting weaker over time. Therefore, you extrapolate back in the past that 6,000 or 10,000 years ago it was impossibly large. Therefore, the Earth is no older than 6,000 years. No, the magnetic field fluctuates up and down, up and down. They completely ignore that. They just pick the last century of data. This is a classic case. You go to Fox News, even George Will, who's relatively intelligent among these people, and they'll still say this lie over and over again. There hasn't been any warming since 1998. False. Right up there, it's false, but just let me show you why. This is the kind of data we're talking about. It's very noisy. It has the El Nino, southern oscillation type of behavior in it. You don't generalize from one year to the next because of that noise level. You average it out. This is a 5-year line, the red line is a 5-year rolling average, to see what the overall trend is and get rid of the noise. What do? They pick this spot right here, 1998. For those who are here in LA in 98, that was a freakish El Nino year. We had record rains, first time I'd ever had a geology field trip rained out, 2 of them actually. And that's an anomaly. That's typical, you know, the most wet year and warmest year because the southern tropics were producing rain. The years that follow it, naturally, are going to be cooler. You cherry pick that one point and then look at a few points after, it looks cooler. That doesn't prove anything. You've forgotten that you have to use rolling averages. I stretch out that time scale here. So here's 92, 93, 94. There's the peak at 98, that record El Nino year. And the next 2 are La Nina years, which are cooler. So yeah, it looks like cooler climate's cooling there. And then you ignore the rest of this. Okay? In fact, all the temps from 2003 to 2010 are as high or higher than 98 with a couple of La Nina bumps down. Okay? So you cannot dishonestly grab that one point and claim it stopped warming because actually they are getting warmer. Or you'll hear them say this. This is another example of cherry picking. Oh, well, in the medieval warm period, the Vikings were farming on the south tip of Greenland. Well, that's true, but it's irrelevant. Okay? The medieval warm period, about 950 to 1250 AD, was actually only on average 1 degree centigrade warmer than the Industrial Revolution. It wasn't as warm as you think it was. And it was only up in the North Atlantic region, North America, Greenland, and Northern Europe. The global temperatures, what we actually use, was cooler. Okay? You've got to use global averages. You can't use any one local area. It means nothing. Okay? And so what you get then is, here's the medieval warm period just around the North Atlantic. That's the warmest it ever got. There's global warming today. Okay? It's shot way off the scale, even in the medieval warm period. They won't mention that. This is something you also see in science deniers. In science, you make a mistake in print especially, no one forgets it. Okay? You're hounded the rest of your life. Okay? No one allows you to keep on repeating any mistake you've made. Okay? And if you don't do that, your scientific cred is just shot to pieces. Okay? I've dealt with creationists that basically they do the same script over and over and over again. They never change a thing. Their arguments are 50 years old or older, all debunked, and they never once throw one out. Dwayne Gish, who I debated once before and just passed away a couple of years ago, is famous for spouting one of these myths in front of an audience and getting corrected, and the next night in front of a different audience going back to the same old argument because he knows the audience don't overlap and they don't know he lied the night before. Okay, that's not honest in my book. The climate deniers, same story. They'll repeat the same myths. This one about cooling since 98, which I just debunked, or the medieval warm period. You will never see those things drop out of the Fox News bubble. They keep on blabbing them on as if they had any content. Or climate models aren't perfect. Well, no one ever said they were, okay? And they're not the issue anyway, okay? It doesn't matter how many times you correct them, they never stop carrying these myths forward, okay? As I said, scientists are not allowed. If you're being watched by your other peers, you better damn well keep it straight, okay? This is what propagandists do. And there's a man who knows a lot about it who said this. If you tell a lie big enough and keep on repeating it, people eventually come to believe it. And that, of course, was Joseph Goebbels, the Nazis' propaganda chief, and sort of the father of modern propaganda. Okay, I mentioned this one already. Lists of scientists. They'll say, oh, I've got a list of scientists who don't agree with evolution. Or I've got a list of scientists who don't agree with climate change. Like it's a popularity contest, right? Science is not done by voting. It's done by actually looking at data, okay? And real data, okay? At most, these lists typically only have a few tenths of a % of real scientists on them, and they're usually in fields that have no relevant background. They're not climate scientists in one case, or evolutionary biologists or paleontologists in the other. If you don't believe me, just look at Project Steve. NCSC did a very clever thing. Rather than try to get every scientist around the planet to agree with evolution, which would be an impossible task, instead what they did is they have a site on their site where they have Project Steve. Your name is Steve, Stephen, Stefan, Stephanie, Estefan, any cognate thereof, and you have a PhD in a relevant field, you have to have that too, then you sign on to this list, and you're on Project Steve. And they named it obviously after Stephen Jay Gould. The list, I think, is now 1,200 scientists, just with that name alone. If you extrapolate upward, that's like 99% of all scientists that exist. Okay? Same thing happens to climate deniers. You can find some Joe from the obscure nowhere who will say what you want him to say if you pay him. Okay? And right after the famous IPCC report that won the Nobel Prize in 2007 came out, the next day, the Lobby Institute, the American Enterprise Institute, offered 10,000 plus expenses to any scientist who would write against it. Talk about hired guns, okay? And also talk about credibility, okay? Some of you know about Jane Zithoff, senator from Oklahoma, biggest climate denier in all of Congress, although there are many of them, sadly. He'll often go on the floor of Congress and say, oh, I got 400 scientists who don't agree with global warming. You look at the list, it's mostly TV weathermen. You know what it takes to be a TV weatherman? You got to look good on camera, especially females, okay? And that's it, right? If you can read a teleprompter, that's about the only other requirement. Very few of them have ever had much training in meteorology as a science. If they had, it's just a course or two. So I know more about them, and I'm not a meteorologist either, okay? But I can teach it, all right? They're not climate scientists. They're TV weathermen. They're media figures. People can't get the distinction between the two, okay? And the rest of the list, amateurs, obvious people connected to Nile Institute or oil industry, no real climate scientists of any caliber, okay? A guy by the name of Arthur Robinson's family in the little obscure town of Cave Junction, Oregon, has got this grandiose named institute for his house, And he circulates the so-called Oregon petition. It's got thousands of names on it. Mickey Mouse is one of the experts, by the way. Cartoon characters, duplicated names, corporate names, phony names. It's just a list of garbage. And nobody has time to weed it all out. When I said quote mining in the first part of that list, some of you said, got to be creationists. They use that all the time. Literally, that's all they do. They never do real research. Creationists find what we write, chop out a little piece out of context, and that's their argument. It's never based on stuff they actually created themselves, okay? Example from the climate denier community, the ClimateGate story, okay? Pick a couple of words out of context, the way scientists speak in shorthand, out of thousands of pages of stolen emails, and you're bound to find something that you can make sound suspicious, okay? I won't go over the details of this, but it's all been shown to be basically innocuous. 3 separate commissions in the U.S. and 3 more commissions in the UK have all cleared the people in this of any wrongdoing, just sloppy language. That's all they did, okay? And yet, of course, it shows up endlessly on Fox News as if it has any merit at all, okay? The false dilemma, right? The creationists love to say, okay, here's my audience in front of me, most of which are Christians, as typically they have. I'm going to present the creationist side, and then my opponent is, by definition, as far as I'm concerned, an atheist, right? That's how they try to paint you in a debate. You submit to evolution, therefore you are an atheist, okay? Well, first of all, of course, as you know from the Clergy Letter Project, tens of thousands of ministers, rabbis, and priests have signed on to accepting evolution. That rules that out right there. But even the other part of the false dilemma, well, what kind of creationists are you? Young Earth? Old Earth? Theological, liberal creationists? There are a variety of types. It doesn't make your particular kind right if the other side happens to be wrong. Okay, and the same goes with climate deniers. Okay, they will look for what they think is a weak spot in their opponent's argument, like, again, climate modeling as it was done 30 years ago, and say, okay, there's something wrong there, therefore the whole field is false. Okay? Create this black and white image. Either accept all the data or you all throw it out. It's the old hippie phrase, if you're not with us, you're against us, right? The world is all shades of gray. Black and white are really rare. And the basic thing to remember here, when an idea is really well established, like evolution, like global climate change, at a certain point, the burden of proof shifts to anyone who would deny it exists. When Charles Darwin wrote Origin of Species in 1859, the burden of proof was on him then. He had to make up a conclusive case that evolution happened, defend it with a lot of evidence, and he provided a mechanism which was successful as well. 160-some years later, now the burden of proof is on a creationist to overcome everything that's been done since 1859. Okay? Now, what you'll get, of course, is a lot of this, here's somebody who doesn't agree with you, right? Every field has its contrarians, its mavericks, its people who don't want to go along with the mainstream. It has more to do with the psychology of that person than it does to do with any data, usually. Okay? That doesn't mean that their views necessarily override all of their opponents. Okay? There may, if you accept the idea that maybe there were 2 people over at the Hadley Climate Research Unit in East Anglia in Britain that messed up and wrote those things in the emails, that doesn't make every other climate scientist in the world a co-conspirator, right? Even if that were true, which it's not. Okay? So you've got to remember, when we talk about consensuses there, it's based on overwhelming amounts of data. It's not just somebody thought up and then everyone else was happy to accept. The burden of proof is on the dissenters. My friend Jim Powell wrote a recent book on the Inquisition of climate science to say this very nicely. Scientists show no evidence of being more interested in politics or ideology than the average American. Does it make sense to believe that tens of thousands of scientists be so deeply and secretly committed to bringing down capitalism, American way of life, that they would spend years beyond their undergraduate degrees working to receive masters and PhDs, then to work in the government laboratory and university, plowing the deep oceans, forbidding deserts, icy poles, torrid jungles, all for less money than they could have made it in the industry. Believe me, oil industry pays a lot better than academia. All the while biding their time like a Russian sleeper agent in an old spy novel. Scientists tend to be independent, resist authority. That's why you're apt to find them in a laboratory, in the field, as far as possible from the prying eyes of supervisors. Anyone who believes you can organize thousands of scientists into conspiracy has never attended a single faculty meeting. To me, it's actually sad that anyone would believe scientists are like that. It's like the pot calling the kettle black. Conspiracy-minded people see us as conspirators. But believe me, in my scientific community, everyone will be happy to shoot me down every chance they get. Okay? There's no way you get any 2 people to agree unless you have strong evidence. Okay, and then, as I said, Missing the forest for the trees, side issues. You know, you divert your attention here, and like the magician does, he gets you to look one way, while meanwhile the elephant in the room is standing right over here, okay? Creationists spend tons of time on these ridiculous side issues that have no relevance whatsoever, like the old ideas of Ernst Haeckel from 150 years ago. Who cares? Except as historians, okay? Or other things like the Piltdown forgery. Sure, it was a forgery. You know, we have tens of thousands of good specimens that are not, all right? And they're dodging the overwhelming evidence, right? This is this black and white real world. One piece of bad apple spoils the whole batch, girl, all right? Global warming skeptics do the same thing. They'll focus on what they think is weakest about data, like modeling. They'll ignore all the fact the planet's screaming at us that climate's changing, right? The ice caps are melting. We just had the worst hurricane ever recorded in the Philippines, okay? That all doesn't matter, right? Oh, well, the climate models aren't perfect. That's what they'll tell you. That's what they actually said on Bill Maher last Friday. Okay, so it's all about science versus science? No, it's about PR versus science. Right? Real scientists aren't on one side of this equation. It's just or only on one side, not on both. Creationists don't do their own research. They focus on criticizing real science, and they try to win the battle by PR. If you doubt me, type in Google the string wedge document. That's all you need. And you'll go to a copy that's preserved somewhere in the internet. Of course, Discovery Institute has erased their copy. But an original copy of the document founding of Discovery Institute back in the late 90s, when intelligent design was still a rising cause, where they deliberately and clearly state their purpose to have a giant PR campaign to push their viewpoint. Nowhere in the document does it talk about actually establishing scientific evidence for their viewpoint. It's all about PR, okay? And likewise, look at all these people in these libertarian institutes who deny climate change. They're not doing climate change research. Their whole time is spent attacking scientists. Right? That's not the way you get science done. You don't go out like that. You go do science yourself. Millions of dollars spent on this, okay? And real science, by the way, anyone who is too good at PR is usually actually viewed negatively, right? If you spend too much time promoting yourself, most scientists will immediately step back and say, what's wrong with this guy? You know, you're supposed to be humble. You're not supposed to promote yourself. You're not supposed to sell yourself. Which is funny because then the media will tell us you have to sell yourself in order to get more funding, you know. So it's a tough thing, but we don't like to be in the public news all the time. If you doubt me and the rest of the scientific community, let's take a look at one scientist in particular. Richard Muller up at UC Berkeley, very well-established physicist up there. But at the start, he was a pretty big skeptic of climate science, and so therefore he was paid by the Koch brothers, by ExxonMobil, and a bunch of other these big energy companies to fund a study to pick apart the existing data from climate change, okay? And then he was asked the next year to appear in front of Congress in a hearing in the House Science Committee, which is all run by climate deniers, by the way, on March 29th, 2011, to show what he had come up with. And there it is. There's the three original studies from Goddard, from Hadley, and from NOAA. There's his data in black. They all match. Okay? And he said that to the Republican congressman who thought he was a friendly witness. Okay? You guys are wrong. Climate data from all these institutes is right. And the climate is changing. One scientist who was willing to speak truth to power, even though he was paid by the other side. Pretty admirable in my mind. Okay. So that raises this issue. Where is it coming from? And those who are in this room old enough to remember Watergate, which is not that many anymore, okay? And remember the movie version of Watergate. Remember Hal Holbrook in the parking garage saying, "Follow the money," which I don't know if the real Deep Throat told that to Woodward or Bernstein or not, but either way, that's the way you find out. Who's going to gain from this particular point of view? Well, we already know the answer on creationism, right? They have a gigantic amount of funding from all these wealthy churches and mega churches, the Discovery Institute, Falwell's Creationist, Liberty University, Oral Roberts. They have millions to spend on this campaign, and of course, lots of dedicated followers. Well, climate deniers have the same story in a different form. They have right-wing institutes like Marshall Institute and SAPP, and they met with ExxonMobil in April of 1998 in the API, American Petroleum Institute headquarters, which is a lobbying group for the oil industry. And they actually planned a $20 million campaign to get respected scientists, cast doubt on climate change, get a PR effort going, and lobby Congress. This was a leaked memo. It was the smoking gun, proof that the oil companies are paying the bill for climate denial. It's been duplicated many times. You can actually do internet searches to find out which members of Congress have the biggest donations from oil companies, and guess what they vote like. Okay? They're all basically funded by ExxonMobil, the Koch brothers, other oil companies, and energy interests in coal industries. That's basically, they're the puppets of these powerful organizations. Now, my book is more than just evolution, climate change, although those are the two that are highest in thing. I want to point out that the strategy is universal to anyone who wants to deny science. They've got to attack us just like creationists, just like Holocaust deniers do. Okay? Very nice book on the AIDS denier crisis. You may not realize this. But at one time, there was a handful of maverick scientists who denied that HIV caused AIDS. Okay? You say, how the heck could that be? And that was out in the 80s, right? People were dying like flies, and they found the gene and everything. Well, they did the same thing. Quote out of context, pick on small differences, claim that it's a conspiracy of scientists or the big pharma, find their list of scientists who doubt that HIV caused the same strategy. Okay? Now you say, well, how could this be of any big deal? This is crank. Why would this be serious? In 1998, Thabo Mbeki was elected president of South Africa, one of the countries with the highest incidence of AIDS. During the 8 years he was in power, his health minister was an AIDS denier. Some woman, it was called Dr. Beetroot because she used witch doctoring as the official state policy of South Africa, the biggest country outside of Egypt in the African continent. 300,000 people got AIDS during that period of time. Okay? They're all losing their lives thanks to this government and its backward policy. Some of you know about the anti-vaxxers. Same strategies from them as well. A very emotionally motivated group of people. They have a child in their family who has autism spectrum disorder. It's a very wrenching experience. I know this. I am partly ASD myself. Okay? And then they attack the scientific community for being a big conspiracy to suppress this evidence that those vaccines they gave to their kids back when they were a year and a half are somehow causing this. Okay? We've all seen this already. It's all been debunked, and yet they'll look at a handful of cases, they ignore the evidence that doesn't support their idea. They'll quote mine, they cherry pick, they play PR games, especially with Jenny McCarthy, the former Playboy Playmate, who's basically their spokesperson. That's such a great medical source. And then, of course, they have this false dilemma strategy. They won't accept that ASD is largely genetic. That's what almost all the research is showing now. It's mostly inherited from males through their fathers, and usually when the fathers are older. That has a lot to do with it. You can't change your genes, at least not yet. Okay? And so they don't like the idea. Their genes are responsible for their child's ASD, so therefore they say, it's got to be those vaccines I gave him. So they'll do this fancy thing. They'll say, oh, well, look at the increased incidence of ASD over the last 30 years. And they'll say, oh, it's due to vaccines. Well, it's also, you could blame it on organic food sales if you liked. That's increased. David Gorski, who blogs as Orac, says, well, you could blame it on the Macintosh computer, which came in the 80s and began to expand. What happened here is that it wasn't diagnosed before the mid-1980s. It didn't have a name. Asperger's wasn't officially named till then. And then it was not until the 90s that various state and government agencies started keeping track. That's why the numbers are rising. We're just counting it and diagnosing it for the first time. If you want to play that game, here we go. The rising number of autism cases correlated with the rise of Jenny McCarthy's fame. All right, so we go back to our climate deniers and our creationists. What amazes me, if you go to the Discovery Institute site, which was founded originally to push ID creationism and then sort of phased back once they lost in court in 2005, first thing you said on their homepage, climate denial. Two completely interlocking causes. They promote okay? We all know the official GOP platform, all climate denial, okay? And a lot of it was anti-evolution as well. But you remember both in the 2008 and in the 2012 GOP presidential contests, right, when they weeded out all the clowns, okay? What was it? 8 out of 9 were climate deniers and also creationists in 2008, and the same was true in 2012. I think Huntsman was the only one who disagreed with the majority. These are guys who could have been the most powerful person on the planet, and they were aspiring to 2 forms of science denial, okay? So all this stuff, of course, comes back to who promotes it, and we all know the answer. Fox News and Murdoch. Basically, if you just hear it from that source of viewpoint, you will never know that this is wrong. Okay, and so we ask, well, why is this? Why are they so out of line with what we know to be true? Okay, it's strange because we all love our science and technology. I mean, we're all addicted to our little toy in our pocket all the time now. In fact, my students are always getting run over because they're walking around texting all the time, okay? We love science technology. It's kept us alive. It's made human death rates go down and infant death rates go down, okay? Yet the moment science tells us something we don't like, what Gore conveniently called an inconvenient truth, then all of a sudden, oh, well, science is no good. I don't want that piece of science, just this piece. Okay? You can't have it both ways, right? You got to accept it or not. We all know why creationists are motivated. Science tells them something their religion does not accept. That's what motivates them. The climate deniers, we look closely at where they come from, hardcore libertarian conservative ideology institutes, mostly these big think tanks. Usually what motivates them is a fear of big government. Big government is an evil in their mind. Anything that regulates business in any way, therefore, is evil, especially if it comes from scientists and pushing climate change. Okay? And I would argue, if you think about it, scientists are not killjoys, right? We don't want to mess up your parade, okay, or rain on your parade to make the right metaphor. Okay? We would love to tell you what you want to hear all the time. But when we have data in front of us that tells us what we call an inconvenient truth, things we say you should know, even if it's not pleasant news, that's all the more reason to take us seriously. Because we're not the kind of people who want to tell you bad news. It's not our job to be killjoys, okay? A little cartoon here says this very nicely. For those who don't know the context, Archimedes, the most brilliant man in 5th century BC, is drawing his geometry circles in Syracuse, and the Romans attacked under explicit orders to capture him alive, and then a Roman killed him, said, "Do not disturb my circles, tell that to the edge of my sword." Okay? Or here's Bruno at the stake. "Oh, about that whole Earth revolving around the sun thing, maybe we could just think about it." Okay, here we go. "I'm not a monkey's cousin. Get the me, Charles, Satan." And then here's Albert. "If I could travel alongside a beam of light." "Albert, stop daydreaming in class. You'll never amount to anything." And then those of you remember the big fuss about the Large Hadron Collider over in Europe, in France and Switzerland. They're all worried the Earth would come to an end once they started this machine up. Well, all they did was discover the Higgs boson, okay? All right, and so there was big protests. So I love this conclusion here. Science, if you ain't pissing people off, you ain't doing it right. All right, if science tells you something you don't want to hear, all the more reason to believe it's right, because we aren't here to stop you believing what you want to believe. Okay, so this is what we have, this big sort of rearguard effort to stop inevitable reality, or reality check as the title of my book is, from getting us anywhere. There's a surprising and very scary sort of aspect to this that's really scared me, especially as a working scientist. The tactics now are just like the Inquisition that we were just pushing down a minute ago. Jim Powell points this out in his new book, Inquisition of Climate Science. We're seeing the way they handle this. They don't like the message. They don't go out and improve it. They attack the messenger. Okay? Chris Mooney did this in his book, A Republican War on Science, as well. Galileo, as we all talk about the famous metaphor, he spoke truth to power, right? He was threatened by torture by the Inquisition itself and recanted his Copernican ideas and then whispered under his breath, supposedly, "E per se muove," but it still moves. But then he still paid for 10 more years of house arrest. He never left his house after the Inquisition tried him, okay? And we had this bizarre case where Rick Perry is comparing himself to Galileo. Exactly, he's the Inquisition, and Galileo was the scientist speaking the truth. Okay? But it's scary. In both the US and Australia, climate scientists have been attacked, their families attacked, hate mail, bombs, threats of all kinds. Inhofe has tried to basically put scientists on trial because they supposedly committed potentially criminal behavior under the Federal False Statements Act. In other words, because climate science is false in his mind, therefore we are federal criminals. That's his way of attacking it, okay? You all remember Ken Cuccinelli of Virginia, who fortunately did lose his election last week for governor of Virginia. He was on all these bizarre right-wing causes, like covering the breast of the Statue of Virtue on the Virginia State Seal. Very important cause to be worried about. He was also harassing Michael Mann, then working at the University of Virginia, trying to have a big sort of, witch hunt. Every bit of data he had to relinquish. Well, you give everybody your data, they're going to ruin it for sure, okay? Luckily, Mann left Virginia, is now at Penn State, so he doesn't have to worry about Cuccinelli. All right? This is the way the McCarthy group, witch hunts to persecute anybody they didn't like, okay? And Mann says it very nicely. Human-caused climate change is reality. There are clearly some who find this message inconvenient, and unfortunately they appear to be willing to turn to just about any tactics to suppress that message. So, now I got you thoroughly depressed. Let's talk about a few things that might change in the future. And I'm not saying they will change, but they certainly could. Where are our sources of hope? Well, certainly this diagram is not one. Okay, that's why I put it up here. This is a plot of, on this axis, percentage accept evolution, up to 80% right there, and the gross domestic product, sort of a rough measure of how wealthy this nation is, therefore roughly how much they would spend on education as well. And all these countries up here in the sort of pale aqua color are Northern European, right? They have the highest rate of acceptance of evolution and also fairly rich countries. Then down here are Southern Europe, Italy, Spain, Slovenia, so on, Greece. This is the old Iron Curtain bloc, Eastern Europe. And look at that anomaly right there, labeled USA. We have the lowest acceptance of evolution, a very important measure of science literacy, of any industrialized nation in the world. We're just above, slightly above Turkey, with a fraction of the wealth that Turkey has to spend on their kids. Okay? I submit to you this is one of the biggest issues for our science literacy. Whenever you do these science literacy tests, and we always come out like at the bottom of the list, the questions that throw us off are anything to do with astronomy, geology, archaeology, paleontology, everything that creationists deny exist. Okay? Big chunk of our science education. So you say, well, what can we possibly do? I have 40 years of battle scars in this hide, battling creationists. Ever since I was an undergrad, I started fighting with them. Okay? And then before that, still was debating it. Okay? And it never seems to get any better, it seems like. They're never gone. There never seems to be a trend in turning the tide. And you study sort of conservative polls like Gallup poll. Well, they ask a question, the same one they've asked for 45, 50 years now. It's always phrased the same way, and it's loaded with so many components that invariably it gets, well, 45% of the Americans are creationists, and it's been true for 40 years. If you actually poll them and break the pieces down, that's all in this one question that Gallup asks, okay? Turns out it's not quite as scary as that, all right? When the question is asked just about the age of the Earth, only 18% of people are young Earthers. I think it's younger than 10,000. That's much smaller than you think from the Gallup numbers, okay? Only 10% reject continental drift, which of course creationists think doesn't exist. And 53% of Americans agree that animals and plants have evolved. It's just humans they won't accept, right? They actually like Darwin as long as he doesn't touch us, okay? And here's something I find very encouraging, especially in this audience, okay? Fundamentalism, look at their numbers. They're on the decline steadily now for several decades, okay? You had a big rebirth in the 80s, in the Reagan years. It's going downhill again, okay? Especially among younger people. They're getting older and older and dying off and not being replaced. And they may be still a very big group of people, but they're not as big as they were. And why is that? I blogged about this a couple of weeks ago. What's been happening is that people who might have been swayed by them maybe 20 years ago, now they watch it when they get power in the state of Virginia, state of North Carolina, state of Louisiana or Texas. And they start enforcing all these anti-women, anti-gay, anti-science policies as state policy. And that drives a lot of people away from the right wing. I mean, the right wing got what they wanted. What did they do? They shot themselves in the foot. Okay? So we're seeing huge changes now, especially the younger generation, which is generally not anti-woman, anti-gay, and anti-science. This is what I think is a very encouraging figure right here. This is the trend in affiliation, religious affiliation, as reported in a number of things, Pew Research in this case. And here it is by generation. The oldest generation here and the youngest generation. The non-affiliated, in other words, religious, and the oldest generation, every generation younger. So there's my generation, the boomers. Here's the Gen Xers. Here's the older millennials. They're about 30% are non-religious in some form or another. And then here's the first generation, first data from the younger millennials, born since 1990. They're about almost 40% non-religious. The non-religious members of this country are now outnumbering every other religion in this country except for Catholics and fundamentalists. All the other groups in Protestantism and Judaism, Hinduism are a tiny fraction compared to us. We're a big block, guys. We have power, although we don't seem to be able to use it very well. Okay? And if you watch the studies that people like Phil Zuckerman have done, where they've traveled to Denmark and other countries that have very low rates of religiosity now. They're just about as atheist as they come. Okay? What they found was that what makes these countries, and especially Northern Europe, Scandinavia especially, Germany as well, is a strong social safety net. Okay? They have health care, unemployment benefits, retirement, disability, child care, paid vacations. Right? They're covered cradle to grave. And what happens to that? They stop praying so much. Right? What do you have to pray for when your government covers you? Okay? Now, we all hear this, oh, well, they're a socialist nation. Well, Zuckerman shows they're a happy socialist nation, okay? You can get any arguments you like, but basically, if you don't need to worry so much about your daily living, religiosity disappears pretty fast. A good example of how fast it disappears, in the 60s, Quebec was one of the most conservative religious of all Canadian provinces. It was run by the Catholic Church, fundamentally. And then they had a big election that turned over the entire system, and they started changing the policies toward Catholicism, and within a generation, it became the most liberal of all the provinces in Canada. Okay. Now, what about climate science? Is there any hope there at all? You say, oh, these climate deniers, they're on that Fox all the time. How do we stop it? I'm saying we don't have to worry. Time will change things, okay? There's no issue in the climate science community itself anymore. We don't debate something that's been established for 20 years, okay? We spend our time looking at the future. We spend our time planning, modeling, predicting the best we can what's going to happen. What's established is behind us now, okay? Yet we are the only major country that still has significant denialists in political positions. And that's actually a good sign, because we're the last one to get out of the denial boat. You'll point to the Copenhagen Summit of 2009 and said, well, we didn't accomplish much. Well, compared to Kyoto a decade earlier, when China, India, and the US did not sign the agreement, all those countries are now on the agreement in 2009, okay? And yes, we didn't get much else done at Copenhagen, but now at least our administration and our country has actually pledged to do something, and maybe we'll actually do it someday. Now, what's more revealing is who else is already on the boat, aside from our government. Oil companies, I have lots of friends in the business. They can all see the end of cheap oil right on the horizon. It's pretty much over in most places anyway, as you can tell when you go drive out and get some gas. They're already into alternative energy. They're spending money to get there before anyone else does. Okay, here's some people that you would not associate with being liberals or socialists in any way. Insurance companies, especially the reinsurers like Swiss Re and German Re, the people who insure the insurers, okay? They're all planning for climate change, right? They don't have an ideological axe to grind. They just got to cover their losses. And that means they have to be realistic, okay? You wouldn't think the U.S. military is a very liberal institution by most people's imaginations, right? They're planning for climate change, right? The generals all over are planning for climate change. They have official Pentagon reports about how they'll fight a war with the world changed, okay? My brother-in-law is in emergency management, and they're all across, all the state and federal emergency management people are all planning for climate change. Now, again, there are politicians who run the higher levels of government, and D.C. may not get much done, but these guys, they're doing their work, okay? Even the largest corporation in the world, General Electric, and many, many other big corporations, in spite of all the PR you hear, they're actually making business models and planning for climate change. And they're working closely with climate scientists, okay? 70% of corporate executives globally plan to increase spending on climate change initiatives between 2010 and 2012, the most recent survey, according to Ernst & Young. They don't have an ideology. They've got to protect a bottom line. They want to stay in business. And staying in business means facing reality. That's what they'll do. And again, in Europe and Asia, there's no climate denier movement that slows the politics down there at all, okay? What are they doing? They're developing and buying up everything that has to do with green technology. So when the time comes to use it, guess who's going to own it? Not us, them, okay? That's parts that's scary. So I said to submit to you, this is sort of a nice way to think about this. Here's our speaker at some big international meeting talking about energy independence, preserving the rainforest, sustainability, green jobs, livable cities, renewables, clean water, air, healthy children, et cetera, and somebody says, what if it's a big hoax and we create a better world for nothing? All right, and I'll stop right there. Thank you.